Thank you for visiting the Roedean Centennial exhibit. The artifacts and documents help to show the Roedean family's influence in early agriculture, California. Visionary contributions from Frederick, George Sr., and George Jr. Roedean set the stage for California nursery to be the largest nursery on the West Coast from North America to South America. This is their early story. The Fig Man. The Fig Man: The Story of Young George C. Roedean, Sr. by Diana Roedean and Joyce Bluford. Animations, Hagos Tavolti. Can you remember being too little to go to school? Can you remember when someone had to watch you to keep you out of the street? You have changed as all people and their communities change. San Francisco is a large city today, but it has changed through time. What was San Francisco like before the 1906 earthquake on the San Andreas Fault? The city was the commercial center of the West. Horses, buggies, and horse cars were still a major mode of transportation to move people and products through the city. Cable cars moved people up the steep hills. Automobiles looked like boxes with wheels. The streets were dirty and noisy. Traffic was chaos with people, vehicles, and horses all moving in different directions. People had to take ferries to cross the San Francisco Bay. There were no bridges. Prior to 1847, local people called this area Yerba Buena. Before the 1868 Great Earthquake on the Hayward Fault, San Francisco was a tiny settlement with dirt roads and no cars. People came from far away to find riches when gold was found at Sutter's Mill in 1848. This started the California Gold Rush. Frederick Christian Roedean, a young man of 23, left his home in Hamburg, Germany in 1847 for a journey of a lifetime. He left Hamburg and sailed from the North Atlantic to South Atlantic, and then around Cape Horn to Lima, Peru. He stayed there until he heard of the wealth people were making in California. He left Lima in 1849 and headed for San Francisco. Fritz and his German friends headed for the Sierra Nevada with mules, oxen, hay, and food supplies to pan for gold in the Mormon diggings. But the roads were impossible to pass during the rainy season. They did not have enough food for their oxen and mule. The life of a miner was hard living. They returned to San Francisco. Frederick Roedean became a founding member of the German Savings and Loan and was a successful mercantile banker. He married Mariana Lazarus in 1867, a German native living in San Francisco, and they lived on Geary Street. 1 year later, on February 4th, they had their first son, George Christian Roedean. Luckily, their home survived the earthquake in October 1868. They eventually would have 5 children: George Christian, Frederick, Henry, Emma, and Marie. As a little boy, George would play in soil, looking for bugs and budding new plants. He was fascinated with nature, which followed him for the rest of his life. He would gather fruit and just like to enjoy the outdoors. George was not happy when he had to go to school. Although school was hard, he did have fun. He was always thinking of tricks and pranks for his friends. George planned and initiated a spitball event for his friends to participate. When the chaos began, he would sit back to appreciate his efforts. A family friend, Dr. Herman Baer, was a professor of botany. He would take his daughter Thekla and George with him to study plants in the San Francisco Bay Area. These plant field trips would leave an everlasting impression on George as they explored the hills and surrounding countryside. George even volunteered to carry the lunch basket without complaining. It was heavy since there was a bottle of wine for Dr. Baer. George began to think like a scientist who specialized in plants, a botanist. George and Thekla had a great idea to earn money when they were about 10. They planted a garden which they weeded, watered, and cared for regularly. They sold their produce, which included lettuce, peas, beans, and radishes to their families. They wrote out a bill of sale listing the vegetables' cost and total. George wrote on his bill for his family, payable in U.S. gold coin. He wanted his bill paid right away. George's father had a friend, Mr. Charles Lose, a pioneer farmer living in the eastern part of the San Francisco Bay, growing peas and walnuts. As George grew older, he was sent with Mr. Lose to Fresno area during midsummer vacation to learn about large-scale wheat farming. He worked on Captain Easterby's 2,000-acre wheat farm in Fresno, next to land that was owned by Frederick Roedean, Fancher Creek Nursery. As George was growing up, his father speculated that the Central Valley of California would become the center of agriculture because it would have trains and water. Along with other Germans, Frederick purchased 80,000 acres in the Fresno area in the late 1860s. In order to get the produce to market, Frederick donated 1,200 acres to Southern Pacific Railroads. He was setting up a commercial center for growing products and transporting them to cities. Frederick Roedean in 1883 founded Fancher Creek Nursery in Fresno. Dr. Gusten Eisen, a professor of natural history from Sweden, was the first manager. Dr. Eisen had come to America to help his brother establish Eisen Vineyards. George Roedean worked with Dr. Eisen when he was not in school and learned much about plants and nursery operations. George was 15 at this time and still in San Francisco going to school. George begged his father for a chance to turn Fancher Creek into a success. His dad replied, "No, you have to finish your education." George graduated from San Francisco Boys High School in 1885. Did George give up? No. Every chance he got, he pleaded with his father to let him run the nursery. Finally, his father gave in. "You have 1 year after your graduate high school, then go back to college." George knew how to run a farm from all the training he received in his youth. He knew the botanical side of plants and felt he could increase production. George understood business. He worked hard and he excelled in salesmanship. He paid off the nursery's debt and had money in the bank at the end of the year. So no more school. George Roedean accomplished many things in his career. As a young adult, he was fascinated by figs, probably inspired from Dr. Eisen. The Smirnoff fig tree grew in California, but it didn't make a profit. The fruit fell from the tree before it was ripe and was too small. The fig wasp was important to pollination, but they didn't know how to use the insect. Nurserymen kept experimenting, but nothing worked. They even tried to take pollen by hand from one tree to pollinate another tree. That failed too. George Roedean, with an introduction from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, went to Turkey where the fig grew successfully. George was intrigued by the complex cooperation of plant and insect. The female wasp lays her eggs in the inner part of the fig, which spreads the pollen. George did several experiments on growing figs in California. He successfully figured out how to mass produce figs. The California fig industry thrived thanks to George Roedean, nicknamed the Fig Man. George Roedean became the owner and manager of Fancher Creek Nursery. George would create events to help with the sales of his new product available to farmers. He would make agreements with the country's leading botanists who were creating new varieties of fruit. Many times they met at California Nursery in Niles. Luther Burbank was known through the world as the plant wizard. He created many new varieties of fruits and vegetables to the world in his unbelievable ability to genetically modify plants. However, Mr. Burbank was more interested in science than marketing his new inventions. Burbank designated George Roedean at Fancher Creek Nursery as the sole introducer and distributor of many Burbank plant inventions. George Roedean Sr. in 1917 purchased the California Nursery Company in Niles, California. George would also purchase property throughout California, looking to expand his business. His son, George Roedean Jr., had shown an interest in continuing the family business. California Nursery Company, under the management of the Roedeans, became one of the most influential nurseries in the West Coast. 3 generations of Roedeans helped make California an agricultural giant.